Hello, hello. This is Dr. Z. Zachary Brooks, going to talk today about culture, cognition, and change. More specifically, we're going to talk about brain and language. So a little background. So in October 2018, I was invited to give a series of talks, and the series of talks was called Culture, Cognition, and Change. Day one was about intercultural competence, and I did a podcast recording of that with the voice over the PowerPoint slides in 3 parts. And today I'm moving on to the day 2 of that week, where I talked about brain and language, and this is really directed towards language teachers. And so this is not discourse expertise on brain and language. I'm not an expert at that, but I could certainly give an introduction to it, and I think that works for a lot of people who don't know much about it, but I think they should know a little bit, especially if they're going to be language teachers, because there's so much information and so much research on the brain and language, and the brain and language and second language acquisition, that if they're going to be a teacher, they should try to understand some of the basic principles of the brain and what their students are going through as they're learning a second language. So I did the presentation at la Universidad Popular Autónoma del Estado de Puebla. It's also known by its acronym UPAEP, and sort of like the University of California, Los Angeles. It's actually better known by UCLA, so the same thing for la Universidad Popular Autónoma del Estado de Puebla. In Puebla, it's better known as UPAEP. So with that, I'll just jump right in. We're doing part 1 of 3 of brain and language today. This is Dr. Z. Zachary Brooks. Culture, Cognition, and Change is the title of the presentation. Also known as the 3 C's, and this is Dr. Z, part 1 of 3. So brain and language. So let's start off with a picture. I guess this is a GIF. I guess that's what this is, of the brain, and this is different phases of the image. And you can see a couple of them. They're sort of very prototypical images you might see of a brain. And first thing you can maybe notice is that as these images cycle through, there's a lot of the skull area, the outer area, that's occupied by a lot of gray matter. And the first thing this indicates, and I know this from taking a class, is that this is likely a young participant doing this, or offering his or her brain for science just to have it looked at. And many times that's the case is for research, is that oftentimes it's young 18 to 24, 25-year-olds who we as academics study, because they're the ones who are accessible on a campus. And so when we see this brain, it has full of gray matter. If you saw an older brain, it might be less full. And over time, the brain, just like you cut down leaves on a tree that become too full, over time our brains have less gray matter. We par away some of that gray matter. Some of that's a good thing, because we can become more efficient with our brain. And some of it, you can see, is not always positive if you have basic brain aging or any sort of brain lesions by accident, stroke, other sort of events. So that's just a really quick overview. And the overview I had for the presentation I gave in Mexico was did a introduction, history, cytoarchitecture, themes, brain research examples, and these are a few, and these are older, but the ones that I can certainly understand and share. So please seek out other resources that can help you find more about brain and language that are more recent. If you're listening to this in academic, you can get a hold of me, and I'm happy to do an interview with you to do a more sophisticated brain and language conversation at some point. And then we have finally brain day 2. I'm going to do this in one sitting in 3 parts. So those are kind of the introductions, the overview of the presentation today, and what I did in Mexico at UPAEP in October 2018. Brain and language. Brain and language. Okay. I'm doing a lot of this introduction stuff, aren't I? Anyway, introduction, history, architecture, themes, representations, and processes, and finally L2 brain research examples. So, like I've done previously, I like to sort of pepper my presentations with little factoids or little things. And the other presentations I've done, I've shared about myself, such as I'm a B-level Hollywood actor, or I was, and I failed out of reading and writing during my freshman year in college because I was not focused. But today I'm going to talk about something different. I'm going to talk about Melvin Kolski. So Melvin Kolski is an American photographer who is famous for his bubble series of photographs that appeared in Harper's Magazine in 1963. We'll kind of talk about those every 7 to 10 slides. So let's begin. Brain and language. So basic definitions we'll start with is that we have the brain and we have the mind. So the brain is the biological structures which are visible to various means, so MRIs, those kind of things. And you can think of also the parts of the brain, the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, those kind of things. And the mind are the cognitive faculties. And this is where, humanity is sort of very, very clear. We have, we can explain lots of things in terms of functions of the brain and how various processes operate, and that's very much the biological structures. But then, the brain gives way, you can think of it in that way, to the mind, where we have this ability to use all these processes in extremely creative ways. Think of any music that you really enjoy, rap music, classical music, whatever it is. That came from someone's brain, but it kind of evolved to something completely different, and that's where humans are extremely creative. So we have the brain and mind distinction when we talk about the brain and language. General ideas. There is no brain for second languages. So now, like I said, this talk was given to language teachers. So it's very important that people understand there is no brain for second languages. We have one brain, and we use that one brain to process all the languages we speak, or can speak, or produce, or understand. Whatever cognitive processing we're doing, we use one brain we have. Our brain does become differently developed when we speak multiple languages, and so we'll talk about that a little bit more. But those are some basic ideas that we're talking about second language, brain, and language. So a definition, and this definition I'll repeat a couple times because it's really dense, but it works very, very well. And the definition is this. So cognitive neuroscience is the perfect term to describe the question of understanding how the functions of the physical brain can yield the thoughts and ideas of an intangible mind. So I touched on that a little bit earlier, how we have the brain and we have the mind. So I'll read it again. Cognitive neuroscience is the perfect term to describe the question of understanding how the functions of the physical brain can yield the thoughts and ideas of an intangible mind. So this is sort of like NASA engineers or SpaceX, wanting to go to outer space. It's just such a fundamental, huge thought and question. And for people who study the brain, it's that same sense of wonder and excitement because the brain is its own universe, and then we have billions of brains around the world, and they're their own universe. And so, just the last part of this definition again, which is so fundamental, how the functions of the physical brain can yield the thoughts and ideas of an intangible mind. I mean, that idea is just so incredible. The quote is from Gazzaniga and others in 2009, and I apologize if I mispronounced that name. So on to the next slide. Now, a little bit of history on brain research. So what's important for scientists and academics know these things pretty well, but other people who haven't studied academia, they think about a lot of things. They're as smart as anyone in the world. The smartest people I've met sometimes are taxi drivers in Mexico. But what's important to understand about science is the the history behind science too, how it came about, and the very human stories that makes science possible. So sometimes science is abstracted away from sort of a day-to-day living kind of thing, and that's for good reasons. We want to sort of isolate things and study them. But we can't abstract things away completely because there's human connections and human stories behind every scientific experiment, every scientific discovery, every thing, and we're building human knowledge bit by bit, and they're really rooted in stories, which is super fascinating. So we're going to start with history. But before we do that, a little bit of Melvin Attili again. So here's a picture. If you're listening to this and not watching it online, what we see here is a picture of a woman in a bubble, and the bubble is seemingly suspended above the air, just floating in a forest with a snow-covered field or snow-covered ground. And it's an incredible photograph. So Melvin Attili, he used a crane and cable to suspend his bubble above the ground. And because I gave this in Mexico, I don't know why I wrote this particular part in Spanish, but Melvin utilizó una grúa y un cable para suspender su burbuja sobre el suelo. So it's a pretty cool photograph, and we'll get more into why he did this a little bit later. But now let's go back to the history of the slide. It's also very much early science because people are just trying to figure out their world, and this is a lot of what science is, or a lot about your own business or about your own life. You try something, it fails. You try to build a fence in the back of your yard, you put it up, it falls down. What do? You go back and you figure out, oh, there's a divot in the back of the yard. I have to now have longer pieces in the middle of that fence in order to build that fence correctly. And this is just basic science. We're constantly trying to figure things out. So we'll make a mistake and continue. So these phrenologists really thought this was some answers to the questions of what the brain is and how it affects our behavior. So the idea was that every part of the brain controlled different parts of our life. So I used the Spanish example, but you can see, and I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but sort of the middle left part of the skull brain I'm looking at, there's something called Nazismo, so Nazism, xenophobia. There's communism, and there's different parts of the brain where people thought that part of the brain is the part responsible for our thoughts about communism. Up above, there's a part about odio, which is hate, and back part of the brain, upper back part of the brain here, is something called sed de sangre, so the thirst of blood, so maybe it's our animalistic desires and so forth. So they thought that part of the brain was responsible for our sed de sangre, our thirst of blood, if you translate it word for word. And now on the slide, I'll actually put some of the functions, and I have little arrows pointing to where they actually are, not just talk about them. So I have odio, hate, superstición, sed de sangre, comunismo, communism, and malaba. So malababa is sort of, I think the best translation is something bad intentions. You have a bad, malicious type of thought process about other things. So continuing in history, the first person people talk about when it comes to brain and language is Broca. So Paul Broca, and you can see a picture on the slide. His name is Paul Broca, and he's a French doctor in 1861. So in the United States at the time, Civil War was starting out, just to give you some historical context if you're an American listening to this. So in 1861, Paul Broca was a doctor at a hospital. And in 1861, he studied a man who had epilepsy in childhood. He lost his speech around the age 30, and he understood everything. So he was functional in many, many ways. He could understand everything that was said to him, but he could only say the word tan, or in French it'd be more like ton. And so in history, he's known as ton, or tan, because that's the only thing he could say. And so Broca thought, well, gosh, this is interesting. What's going on here with Tang? And what eventually what we're going to see in the next slide is actually Tang's brains. You can see for yourself and guess for yourself very quickly what was going on. So here's the brain. And if you look at the brain, you can see in the front left damage. You can just obviously see there's some sort of lesion or damage, a depression within the brain. And gosh, that's pretty horrible. And I've circled it so you can see it even more. And that part of the brain in this man, Tang's brain was damaged. So Broca thought, well, what's going on here? And so the first thing he did is he inferred that speech is localized to the front of the brain. So this is building on phrenology, where people thought, well, this one part of the brain is responsible for this action. Broca now had real evidence from a brain, and his big invention right at this moment, his big discovery, was just to infer with evidence that the front part of the brain was responsible for speech. He subsequently studied 25 patients with similar left hemisphere lesions, and he concluded that speech is localized in the front left region. So this is a huge step in brain research very early on being in 1861. The next person we're going to talk about is Wernicke. He's a German guy, so he's called Wernicke, and he's a German doctor in 1874, so 13 years after Broca. And that sounds like a long time in a lot of cases, but science sometimes, in 10-year increments, can move extremely quickly. So 1874 in Germany, the next door country, Wernicke, a doctor, saw a patient. The patient, Suzanne, was aged 59, and she came to Dr. Wernicke with a headache. So her answers to questions, so when he was asking her questions to try to get a diagnosis, her answers to questions were completely confused, but always well articulated. That's interesting. So she obviously could speak extremely clearly, and that was wonderful, but it's just that she wasn't actually listening, apparently, to what the doctor had to say. Oh, and this is not an actual picture of the patient, so this is probably not the actual picture of Suzanne, the patient. And the back of the brain is here, and he inferred that comprehension is localized to the back of the brain. Broca studied multiple patients with left hemisphere lesions, and so did Wernicke. They both studied patients with left hemisphere regions. Broca in the front of the left hemisphere, Wernicke in the back of the left hemisphere. So Wernicke concluded that comprehension is localized in the back left region. This was also a huge step. So Broca and Wernicke are really kind of considered the modern pillars, huge foundation pieces for brain and language research. This is in the now 1874 time period. Back to Melvin Kolski, the American photographer in the mid-1950s, so 85 years later. So Kolski, I think I said Kolski, mispronounced his name in the previous, just a second ago. He was inspired by Dali. And Dali had a painting called The Garden of Earthly Delights, in which a nude couple sits in a bubble. So in Spanish, Kolski se inspiró en Dali y su pintura El Jardín de las Delicias Terrenales, en la que pareja desnuda se siente en una burbuja. So he, I read about this a little bit. So Melvin Sokolsky, as a younger person, came across this painting. And it's one of these things in our lives that you come across something just once maybe, or just a few times, whatever it is, and it just sticks with you. And what stuck with him is this idea of a bubble. So that's, where he got this inspiration to do a bubble series later in his life. So back to brain and language. Now I'm going to talk about architecture. So we did some, really basic history, but important history. Broca and Wernicke. Broca had a patient with a problem in the front left hemisphere, Wernicke in the back left hemisphere. The problem in the front was not comprehension, but was speech. The problem in the back was not speech, but comprehension. So now we'll talk about architecture a little bit, some really basic things. So again, Broca and Venica, they're areas of discovery and inferrals, based on evidence from patients, and these inferals really became foundations for a lot of modern brain and language science. So in the front of the brain was definitely language production, also known as speech, and the back of the brain was called language comprehension or understanding. And the parts of the human brain, there's multiple parts. We're just going to talk about lobes, and there's 6 lobes listed on this image on the slide. We're really going to talk about 4 of them. I'll talk about the 6 for this introduction, but we'll eventually just talk about 4. So we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. We also have the cerebellum and the spinal cord. So the spinal cord, everyone probably knows what that is. It's from your back into the base of your brain, and that does a lot of control kind of things, the signals between your brain and your body. Cerebellum is a little bit behind the spinal cord. Going to the lobes, the frontal lobe is a lot of things with decision making, executive control, those kind of things. The parietal lobe, we move into sort of motor related things, and the motor things are important for speech. The occipital lobe in the back is really important for vision, and the temporal lobe, which we've kind of studied already through Broca and Venica, is important for a lot of speech-related things, also a lot of our analytical type of thinking. So one more slide about Melvin Kolski, and then we'll be done with part 1. So Melvin Kolski, so the concept for the bubble photographs came from that reoccurring dream, and he was inspired by Dali. The reoccurring dream in which Melvin himself saw himself floating above unfamiliar landscapes. So in Spanish, el concepto para los fotografías, del burbuja vino de un sueño recurrente en el que Melvin se vio flotar sobre paisajes desconocidos. So it's pretty cool how we can just get inspiration in our lives, and the inspiration then can become actualized in some sort of real product. In this case, the product, this bubble, was used for an artistic and commercial reason. So that's the end of part 1. Come back for part 2, where we continue our conversation on brain and language, focusing on L2 brain and language, especially for teachers of second languages. Thank you. Talk to you soon. Happy deciding. So we can really trace things back in relatively modern times, 1832. It sounds like a long time ago, and in some ways it very much is, but in some ways it very much isn't. It's 200 years in human history is super, super fast. And we're going to go back to something called phrenology. And phrenology was an early attempt to understand the brain-cognition links, so the mind-brain connection. And it was developed by a person named Spurzheim in 1832. And the idea was that the individual parts of the brain, the skull, were responsible for various traits, different parts of our personality, different functions, and so forth. And this idea that there's one part of the brain connected to one function or one behavior or one personality is called modularity. So there's a one-to-one correspondence between things. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And even though it's kind of funny, and I'll talk about this in the next